So today we are really excited and we are honored to be joined in studio by Rick Ayers and by his brother Bill Ayers in Chicago. They have been tireless social justice activists, educators, and writers for many decades. Rick Ayers is a professor in teacher education at the University of San Francisco and a founder of the Communication, Arts, and Sciences School at Berkeley High School. Bill Ayers is a retired professor of education and senior university scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Bill is also a founder of both the Small Schools Workshop and the Center for Youth and Society. Rick and Bill Ayers, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Hello, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
All right. So before we dive too far into this, I want listeners to know that Rick has played a hugely helpful role in helping me to think through the approach for this education series and in suggesting many of the amazing people we ultimately interviewed. So, Rick, I just really want to thank you for being a great thinking partner and enormously helpful.
Well, it's been exciting, and I love how you're developing this project.
All right, cool. So let's take a dive into the conflicting paradigms that we hear about the purposes of education and start with a couple of the most basic questions. Education for what and education for whom? The two of you address these questions in a beautifully written book, Teaching the Taboo, which for me is absolutely must reading for anyone interested in social justice and education. And what I really loved about the book is that you don't just focus on policy debates like whether we need more or less testing, but that you invite us to go deeper, to really challenge ourselves about every single thing that we think we know and believe about education, and to ask the simple question at every turn, why? So what are some of the whys that you think we should be asking ourselves?
Well, Ken, I think that to begin with, we have to always, whatever policy we're considering, whatever curricular intervention we're considering, we have to always ask education for what purpose? Why are we in this enterprise in the first place? And the answers, the more you explore them, the more complicated the answers get. Of course, we all want our kids to grow up to live full, complete, happy, purposeful lives. We want them to be able to love other people. We want them to be able to work and produce and contribute to society. But I think we have to say right from the start that if we aspire to educate free people, there's a certain requirement that goes with that, and that is that we don't want to teach either explicitly or implicitly that the highest value you can aspire to is obedience and conformity. We want to teach kids the values of initiative and courage and creativity and imagination, because free people require those kinds of qualities more than they require obedience or rule following. You know, when we talk about, for example, being a good citizen, we can talk about that in terms of personal responsibility. We can talk about it in terms of civic engagement. But for free people, being a good citizen involves being able to think critically about everything that's presented to you and being willing to engage with others in kind of questioning the status quo, wondering about what's just and fair and decent, and then making the kind of moves that one has to make in order to contribute to this kind of society that we would like to live in.
Nice.
And I would add that you notice in discussions about policy and in all the debates about school, the farther people are from the classroom, the more firm their opinions are. The people who are far away are certain they know the answer. So one thing we try to do is zero in on the actual human exchange that is the classroom, that is a classroom community. This is not something that can be done by distance learning on a TV monitor. It's a human collective endeavor. And I get caught up in the policy debates, but frankly, I'm bored by them. I'm much more interested and have a lot more passion about life within the classroom itself. And when you're there, you realize even the term teaching is problematic. It's a transitive verb. It suggests that I am handing something to you. I teach you. I possess something that you don't have, and I'm handing it over. And once you're in the classroom, you realize that that's a really inadequate term, that we are doing something together, again, a human, messy, complicated enterprise. And a teacher, if I have to use the word, is only good if she constantly questions her own authority and constantly challenges the given dogma of what a body of knowledge is. So the development of knowledge is a constantly evolving thing. And what we're interested
teaching,
in...
Rick, teaching like any layered and complicated term is something you have to kind of always hold out as a question or
Right.
as a tentative thing. You can't kind of say, here's a simple, it's more of a process or a journey than it is a destination and an answer.
Right.
But I think the kind of teaching that I've seen you do and the kind of teaching that I think you advocate, that we both advocate, is a kind of teaching that's more difficult in some ways than either the kind of transmission of knowledge, or even more difficult than learning, because the kind of teaching that we advocate is a teaching that is always searching for the next question and always searching for a posture that can let people learn. So that means it's not so much that I stand on the stage and tell people things, but rather I have to create an environment, I have to create a physical and aesthetic and emotional environment where people can ask the next question and the next question and the next question. That's much more difficult than having a lesson plan and then delivering the goods.
I really like the way you frame that, and I want to go back to the idea of challenging the dogma, which brings back the title of your book, Teaching the Taboo, Courage and Imagination in the Classroom. What does that mean to teach the taboo?
Well, I think, we think of the taboo as anything that challenges the dogma of common sense. So everything that's settled, the wondrous thing about a classroom is a classroom can be a setting where the curriculum of questioning is always in play. That is, a dogmatic classroom, whether it's progressive or conservative or traditional or experiential or whatever it might be, a dogmatic classroom is a classroom where, again, the conclusions are delivered. So you might say a more progressive person might deliver a more progressive view of history and a more conservative person a more traditional view. But in a classroom of the type that we're thinking of, a classroom that teaches the taboo, whatever dogma is on the table, we get to ask the next question. And in some ways, that's why I think Rick and I and many of us, and I think you can, appreciate a classroom as a site of intellectual curiosity, a site of discovery and surprise. The problem for me always with a courtroom is that there's two narratives, and one of them has to be right. The problem with the newsroom is there's a narrative arc that's a beginning and a middle and end, and it has a neat conclusion. The beauty of a classroom is it requires you to always be open to the next thing. It's based on always asking the next question. It thrives on uncertainty and contradiction and dialectics, not on having the perfect answer that sums everything up.
Now, you suggest in Teaching the Taboo that schools are a reflection of whatever society and historical period that they're located in, and in that way they serve to reinforce the dominant values and power relationships of that society. So I think you gave an example in the book of how schools were structured under South African apartheid. Can you talk more about that and how that reflection is playing out in schools in the United States?
Yes, every school in every society in every era is both mirror and window into the society that it's attached to. So in an agrarian, more primitive society, you would be teaching animal husbandry and, crop rotation and whatever. In a theocracy, you would be teaching, obedience to the gods. In an authoritarian situation, you'd be teaching obedience and conformity. And the example I think we use is if you went and saw a school in the old South Africa, all you would have to do is look at the schools and you would know what apartheid is, because the schools under apartheid were a perfect reflection. If you knew what apartheid was, you could predict what the schools would look like. And so when we say, what do schools look like in a free society or a society that aspires to be a democracy or to be run by free people, you'd have to say, well, the schools would be schools that were based on the fragile but precious ideal that every human being is of incalculable value. You would want to see schools where initiative and courage were the underlying curriculum of the whole thing, because that's what's required in a democracy. You'd want to see schools where the fullest development of the group was the condition for the fullest development of any individual, and conversely, the full development of each individual is the condition for the fullest development of the community. So this is what you would say a democracy would look like. And the reason that we think this is important is that when we talk about the goals of education and we say we want the kids to be on time, we want them to do their homework, we want them to not misbehave, we want them to stay away from drugs and alcohol, that's all true, but it's also true in an authoritarian society. It's true in fascist Italy. It's true in apartheid South Africa. So what else is important? And for us, the most important thing is that in a free society, we want to develop free people, and that requires classrooms that are deeply, deeply engaged in asking questions, critically reflecting, needing no one's permission to challenge the status quo, because that's what free people are capable of doing.
I think that it's important to recall that James Baldwin laid this out very clearly in the 60s in his talk to teachers. And he said that every school reflects the society that it's in. But I think what we're also raising here, which is important, is I don't accept a kind of mechanistic idea that reproduction is inevitable. And this is actually a kind of disagreement I have with some of the Marxist scholars of education who claim that there's actually nothing you can do in the schools until the class struggle somewhere else has brought about equity. The schools will perfectly reproduce class society. And we disagree. We believe, and what Bill just laid out was a kind of contention in schools. Schools, like many institutions that are in the superstructure of society, are areas of contention. We fight over these things. So there's a vision of democracy that we're laying out, and there's a very strong power for authoritarianism. I don't really think the authoritarians win this all the time. They have the foundation money, they have the test plans, they have the government megaphone, and they have the Department of Education. But we have the base. We have the people who want deep and important education.
And we also have the moral argument. I mean, we have the argument. The thing that I always think is interesting about the corporate school reform, which kind of rests on three legs. One leg is the reduction of education to a single standardized metric. Two is the destruction of any collective voice of the teachers, whether it's a union or any other association. And third is selling off the public space to private entrepreneurs. The interesting thing about that model, which has been in ascendance for 15 years, backed by the media, every major politician, the foundations, the finance capitalists, and yet that argument has not won. That argument is losing. So I think we should also claim that because we have a vision of freedom and a vision of participatory democracy, we also, I think, have a very important ground in terms of the argument. There's one other point I'd like to make in this regard, Ken, and that is that we talk about schools being both historically and socially and politically situated. And the interesting thing about that, and it's a challenge to us, is that we all recognize, for example, that 150 years ago, if any of us had been teaching in a school, we like to think that the fact of slavery would have dominated our thinking about education. We would have certainly taught abolition. We would have certainly participated in the events that eventually led to the abolition of chattel slavery. And this would have been very important to us. We wouldn't have just simply genuflected in front of this system and carried on as if it was normal and natural. We would have resisted. But that settles nothing for today. So the question we have to ask ourselves today is, where are we situated? What do we see that we find acceptable, wonderful, worth pursuing? What do we find problematic? And how will we participate in developing in our students and in ourselves the capacity to examine things more deeply, question things more thoroughly, and then open our eyes and act on whatever the known demands?
Yeah, that's very important. And I would add that we have to, as we did in South Africa, you could look at the schools and understand what kind of society we live in. We have to look today at our schools to understand what our society is like. We all study the Brown versus Board of Education. We all talk about the great struggle to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the heroic work that people did. And yet I could take you 15 minutes from here to McClymonds High School in West Oakland, and it is all students of color. It is toe up and chained up and has very few supplies, and the situation is dire and incredibly difficult for students. And we could go 6 miles from there to Piedmont High School. And Piedmont High School is well-resourced, open campus, beautiful physics lab. And so it's just crazy that we are living in this day and we sit in school. You can sit in history class in McClymonds and they will teach about Little Rock High School. What are the students thinking when they're teaching Little Rock and the integration struggle, and they're supposed to take a test on it? Don't you think they might look around and say, have we moved forward at all in terms of, I'm not really talking about just integration, but the idea of resources being equitably distributed?
This is a great example because an honest teacher, a teacher who wants to be in dialogue with his or her students, would be the teacher who acknowledges what's as plain as the nose on your face, which is the hypocrisy of teaching the civil rights movement as if it was this triumphant narrative where we won. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Selma. I was pleasantly surprised. I was shocked at how much I liked it because I have very low expectations of Hollywood. But the one thing I would have done, besides my quibbles with history and this and that, the one thing I would have done in this story, which is a triumphant narrative about a very important struggle, 4 months in 1965, and I think they do a hell of a good job with it. But the one thing I would have added is at the end, where they give the little historical notes about where the various players are now, where's Andrew Young, where's Hosea Williams, I would have said, where is voting rights? Where are we on that great struggle? And I think you want to be the kind of teacher who is not lying to kids. You want to be the kind of teacher who tells the truth, and that requires sometimes challenging the nonsense that we're fed as, the narratives of the history of this country.
But not only that, if you're the teacher at McClymonds High School, not only would you talk about that, but I think you would walk out of the classrooms with the students and get on the bus.
Absolutely.
And go to Piedmont High School and walk up and down the hall and
Absolutely.
Gaze in wonder. It would cause, the riot squad would come out. If I were a teacher at Piedmont High School, I would get on that bus and go to McClymonds. Come on, you guys.
That. I love that. The other thing I think that you're pointing to is it's not just enough to ask questions, but you have to be willing to be honest about what you see right in front of you, because the kids see it and they know that the grown-up world is a bunch of hypocrites. But here we are in Chicago, where I am. You said 15 minutes away. Well, here I am in a city where 90% of the children in the Chicago public schools are poor. 90%. It's overwhelmingly a black and Latin system, and the mayor closed 50 schools in the black neighborhoods. Now, what am I to, if I'm teaching in this system, and I go along with it, and I don't ever raise a question or a critique or ask the students to question things, aren't I complicit in the system, just as teachers 150 years ago, many of them must have been complicit in taking slavery as just common sense, just the way things are. What are you going to do?
Nice. Well, we spent a lot of time in this series, and you're referencing this contention between the corporate-driven education agenda and a more humanizing, culturally relevant, and socially just education. I'm wondering how you think about that term, socially just education. About 4 months ago or so, there was a big conference out here in San Francisco. Over 1,700 educators and community people came together, teachers for social justice, and we're increasingly seeing movements for social justice education. But people mean a lot of different things by that. You've addressed some of it, but I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts about what it means to be a social justice educator or what social justice education is.
Well, I would say for one thing, social justice education gets attacked and has been criticized by conservative cultural critics as left-wing organizing. Although the Pledge of Allegiance, which I object to pledges being forced on students every day, but it actually says social justice. It's as American as apple pie, right? And so social justice on one level is something that's in the heart of the educational project. Nobody goes into teaching saying, I'm really looking forward to furthering the achievement gap, or I really want to send a lot of kids down to the suspension room. People go into teaching saying, I want success for all students. So everyone has an idea of social justice. What we're struggling to unpack then is, how does that work? How does that go?
And the other thing I would say about that, Rick, is that social justice is a complicated term. And yet it's easy if you're willing to be flexible in your thinking and so on. It's easy to say what it is, but it's still excruciatingly difficult to enact. And I would say social justice is a striving by people in different places, different times, different eras, using wildly different tactics and strategies and approaches to develop a society with more fairness, more equity, more recognition, more participation. This is very much in the tradition of our country and our world, and it's something that we should not be in the least bit defensive about, nor should we think of it as an add-on to an already overburdened set of requirements and curricular demands. It's not an add-on. It's at the heart of the matter. At the heart of the matter, in terms of democracy and participation and freedom, is the idea of justice. I mean, I like what you said, Rick, about nobody goes into it to teach the achievement gap. Nobody goes into, I wonder what the alternative to social justice is, social injustice. I mean, what's the point? I mean, even the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, these folks are foregrounding social justice in several of their, orders and so on. And I think that we should claim it proudly and say, yes, we are about more recognition for more people, more participation, more equity, more access.
And I would add that social justice in education, just like the struggle for social justice in society, is not something you just get one day. It's actually a lifetime avocation. And that's not really something that should be frustrating, like, dang, we never won this thing. It's a constant struggle.
It's a human condition, and it's something we should embrace. But I think people like you are a bit more comfortable with it because you're comfortable with ambiguity. You're comfortable with things that are not finished. You don't need to finish the conversation. You just need to make another utterance in the conversation. And I think that's what folks who are in it for the long haul have to understand. Social justice is not a goal. It's not a point of arrival. Social justice is a process. It's a lifelong striving, and what was important 100 years ago in the struggle for social justice is different today. And again, for the three of us who are have been around for a while and been involved in many struggles, we're both surprised, heartened, and not surprised by the struggle to interrupt and highlight and educate about the serial killings of young black people by police forces. This is today's social justice issue. It won't be the social justice issue forever, but it matters now. And similarly, gay rights, transgendered rights, all these things are things that you might not have seen 50 years ago, but now you see them, now you act on them.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of us can support the concept of social justice education, but we do have this poverty of imagination when we actually try to think about what it looks like, because so few of us experience that in our own education. And you've given a couple of examples. Can you point to any other examples that you find inspiring, either historically or currently?
For me, one of the most inspiring things, because it happened to me when I was a brand new teacher at the age of 20, is the Mississippi Freedom School struggle. And I think that you can find online, and any teacher can look for and find the 1964 Mississippi Freedom School curriculum. And this was a curriculum that came out of the civil rights movement. It was developed by some young people with SNCC, and Charlie Cobb, one of the developers, said in the initial statement about it, he said, look, the black people of Mississippi have been denied many things: fully trained teachers, decent facilities, forward-looking curriculum, but the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. This led to the development of a curriculum that's 24, 25 pages of just questions. Question 1, why are you and I in the freedom movement? Question 2, what do we hope to accomplish? What does the majority culture have that we want? What do we have that we want to hold on to? Now, this is a revolutionary curriculum, and it really is astonishing how far-reaching it is, and how even today it has, if you think about it, on the west side of Chicago, the kids have been denied many things, but the fundamental injury is the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives. And if you think it isn't revolutionary, think about the fact that the three martyrs of Mississippi, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were freedom school teachers who were kidnapped and lynched when they were out investigating the arson bombing of a freedom school. So it had real implications for overthrowing the power structure of Mississippi, the apartheid power structure of Mississippi. That's one, but I can tell you there are hundreds, thousands more going on right now, where students in schools in the Bronx, in the west side of Chicago, in Cleveland, in Boston, are investigating issues in their neighborhood, asking questions, looking to find solutions, and this is an education that lasts a lifetime. This isn't something that you get, take a test on, and then move on. The kind of ability to question, to ask people questions, to investigate, to look at evidence, to make an argument, to go to City Hall, to dig into records, these are educations for a lifetime.
I would add that the approach of social justice education, critical education, is really not so rare and not so precious that it is only found in some fantastically advanced freedom schools. I think you could go into just about any school in America and find social justice teaching happening. I think, again, the closer you're out of the classroom, the more you see this contention going on. Certainly, there are schools, especially some of these charter schools, which have a strongly scripted curriculum, have sort of police coaches who roam around making sure teachers are on script. But essentially, teachers are with kids, and you comply with many of the rules as you would if you wanted to teach at a prison. You get searched, you go through all the steps, but you're with young people. And the truth is, amazing things happen. They begin with listening to students, and they begin with, undermining the kind of authority of the word from above. And I'm talking about social justice education not only in social investigations of the broader context, which may happen in an English or history class, but I'm talking about in science, in math. There's some powerful social justice education happening. And again, in math, this doesn't just mean that we're going to be looking at statistics about police misbehavior. It could be actually in how we regard math itself, that it's not a series of settled facts. It's not algorithms. It's not memorizing formulas. And so social justice is alive and all over these classrooms.
You know, it's funny. I agree with you. I think that it's much more common, and people who are in touch with kids and listening to kids, parents and teachers and community folks, are often challenged to, answer questions that we're not comfortable with, but that lead to a social justice kind of thing. I was suddenly thinking, when you talked about the ordinariness of it, I was thinking of one of the great teachers, Bob Peterson, who was one of the founding editors of Rethinking Schools. And Bob is now the head of the teachers union in Milwaukee. Milwaukee, but what a brilliant teacher. And one of the things I remember about Bob years and years ago, I've known him for a long time, in second grade, they were doing a little bit study at Lake Michigan because they're in Milwaukee, and they went down and they were taking samples and digging in the sand and this and that. And one of the kids said to Bob, "Who owns the lake?" And Bob, he never considered that question. So he said to the kids, "Who do you think owns the lake?" And they began to talk about it. Somebody said Bill Gates. Somebody else said George Bush. And they began to talk about, well, who does own the lake? And what does it mean to own a lake? And then, because they had a sister city in Oaxaca, they began to talk about the meaning of water in Milwaukee and Oaxaca. And it was a phenomenal, curriculum for the second grade, filled with social justice implications about inquiry, questioning, looking at deeper issues of power and control and so on. But it wasn't that he set out to do some phenomenal, social justice education. He just listened to the kids and responded, and they did an investigation.
That's a fantastic story. I want to switch gears a little bit. We have talked a lot in this series about K-12 education and the corporate agenda around standardization, downsizing, and privatization. But since you are both university professors, I'm wondering what parallels you are seeing at the higher education level.
Parallels are stark and striking and frightening. And what we're seeing, I think, is one of the places where freedom and questioning and critical thinking still exists is higher education, and higher education is under pretty sustained attack from the same forces. So that you find even in prestigious universities, the business schools doing very well, and the humanities doing very poorly, because the humanities are where questions are asked, and so again and again we see the drive for the bottom line. University presidents are primarily full-time fundraisers. We see the expense of education going up, so the kids graduate just with killing debt on their heads, rather than, and what we ought to be demanding is free higher education for all. Everyone should have access. Everyone should have be able to further their studies, and it shouldn't cost a thing. But that's not the direction we've been going on. It's becoming privatized in the same ways that the public schools are becoming privatized. So a university like my university, University of Illinois, we joke amongst ourselves, a little bit of kind of dark humor, but we joke among ourselves that we ought to sue the University of Illinois because it's using the name Illinois when it's actually a private university using a public name. University of Michigan is only a public university in name. It costs $30,000 to go there. It's not a public university that supports the children of Michigan at all. In Illinois, I know for a fact that they would rather have out-of-state students than in-state students, foreign students, rather than American students, and the reason is they pay higher tuition, and it's a bean-counting game.
Yes, and the attacks are also taking the same form as they have with K-12, including the idea of having tests you have to take to get out, or tests that rank how well the college taught certain facts. Another thing that's coming in to kind of undermine the university culture, which is a culture of questioning and exploration, is that in a lot of universities now they're trying to create a way that you can get your bachelor's degree or master's degree through a series of competencies. You study something online for a while and take a test, and you've got that competency. And once you rack up 60 competencies, you get a degree. So the idea of a community of scholars, the idea of inquiry is out the window in favor of preset knowledge. So that's happening.
And since we've painted such a dismal picture, I'm going to return to what Rick said in the beginning, which is this is contested space, just as it is in K-12. We haven't given up the ghost, nor have we exceeded all these things, but this is a serious, sustained tendency in higher education, and it's something we have to resist. The reduction, just like in K-12, the reduction of education to a testable, knowable kind of result, the attack on any collective voice of the faculty, which is increasingly undone everywhere, the reliance on adjuncts who are underpaid, under-resourced, underappreciated. All of this is part of the same tendency.
And we have to remember the struggles, when there were the struggles like at San Francisco State for ethnic studies, it was also a struggle, if you may recall, for open admissions.
That's right.
It was not for affirmative action. It was
No.
open admissions. You want to come to the school? Come on in. And that's how it is.
Same with City University in New York.
Yeah,
Same struggle.
open admissions, which now we've given up on. But I actually think
No.
we should get back to that.
Now, let's not give up on it. This is a part of the contested space, is framing the issues properly. But the other thing I would just want to say so that we're very clear, the attacks are very similar. They're being resisted in very similar ways. The corporate agenda has not won. It's very dominant, but it has not won. But it also includes an attack on intellectual freedom. And so we see, again, at the University of Illinois, the taking away, the firing of Stephen Salaita, who was offered a tenured position, associate professor position. He gave up his position in Virginia. His wife gave up her position. They bought a house in Champaign, and the Board of Trustees took away his appointment because of things he had said against Israel during the bombing of Gaza. That's an outrageous attack on freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, freedom, academic freedom, and that's going on everywhere.
What makes you most concerned about the future of public education, and what makes you most hopeful?
Well, the concern is the sustained attack, which, while they don't have the people and they don't have the results and they don't have the ethical arguments, they do have a lot of money and power. So that's a description not of what makes me disturbed or alarmed, but it kind of paints the picture of where the field of battle is. What makes me most hopeful is that I don't believe that kids, large numbers of young people, large numbers of families are going to go along with it. I think people inevitably, because of our nature, there's just some crap we won't eat, and so we fight back. And the fight back takes all kinds of forms, and it comes at you when you're most surprised and least expect it. Again, I think if you look at the last couple of months after the Ferguson verdict and the Eric Garner verdict, and you see young people taking to the streets, the most articulate in Chicago, the most clear-sighted, articulate, brilliant, courageous young people coming together and building a movement, that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see how this movement grew up in all these areas. Well, these things didn't just come from nowhere. There was an ongoing, they say in the valley times, it's important to do the work because we're not always in the mountain times. And I think all the work that has happened over the last 15 years, the kind of base building, the kind of discourse and narrative that's been developed, allowed a kind of leadership to emerge, young, black, queer, brown, women, everyone who has been despised in our society ends up leading these movements. And it also
I'd add one thing to that, Rick. I'd add one thing to that, which is you're absolutely right. The kids in Chicago from a group called BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100, have nourished each other for about 4 years. They've been to national workshops. They've been to organizing workshops. We raised money for them and sent 8 of them to Geneva to testify before the UN Commission on Torture. And they wrote a document called We Charge Genocide, drawing on the tradition of Paul Robeson and that group. And it was an exciting thing for them to go to Geneva, testify at the UN, and have the American delegation have to respond to them. And when the UN Commission on Torture wrote the report on the United States, these young people's words were in that report. What could be more mind-blowing and expansive and wonderful for them and for all of us that happened? The only thing I would add in your litany of how the training and the development and the organizing went on, is I would add the arts, which you were very involved in.
Yeah.
The kids who are leading it in Chicago, almost all of them, or certainly a substantial number of them, were involved in spoken word contests, were involved in writing workshops, were involved in creating art in their high schools and then in the community. And so the arts played a huge role, I think, in rolling out what is becoming a very powerful and exciting social movement.
Yeah, and I would add not only spoken word, but the graphic arts, the wall art, the turf dancing. Every time people are suppressed, and this is, of course, the story of the rise of hip-hop. When everything became corporatized and everything was deadly disco, it was young people in the Bronx with plastic pails, beating on them, who began a new movement, and this is inevitable. It rises again.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered so far today?
We'll just have to do it another day, Ken, because it could go on forever, and there's so much to talk about. But I really appreciate your inviting us on, and it's great talking to you as usual.
All right. Well, our guests have been Rick and Bill Ayers, longtime social justice activists, educators, and writers. Again, Rick is a professor in teacher education at University of San Francisco and a founder of the Communication, Arts, and Sciences School at Berkeley High School. Bill is retired professor of education and senior university scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The book we talked about today, which they wrote together, is called Teaching the Taboo, guaranteed to challenge your thinking about everything in education. Are there more recent things that you have published or are working on that you want to mention, either of them?
Yeah, Rick has a new book out called An Empty Seat in Class, about how teachers deal with the death of a student, and it's a phenomenal book and a very important book. It's something that, again, everyone could learn from. All of us have suffered loss in our lives and in our families, but when a teacher suffers the loss, the death of a student, Rick has written an incredible personal essay, an extended personal essay, and it's a really great book.
Yeah, again, there's two things that young people are thinking about all the time. That is sex and death. And those are the two things forbidden in the classroom. But
Right.
when people die in your classroom, it is actually the kind of gash in the community that takes tremendous creativity on the part of the teacher, and the teacher has to fall back on the community that's been built. But in the profession, we never discuss this. So the purpose of the book is not to give a how-to book, but rather to open up this discussion that's sort of had, on the side by teachers trying to improvise and figure out what to do. Open it up and discuss, what do we do in this crazy world we live in?
All right. That sounds very powerful. We'll definitely have to check that out. Bill and Rick, thank you both so much for sharing all of your incredible insight, wisdom, and inspiration with us today.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Rick. See you later.
All right.